Right, welcome everyone. My name is Faye Mack. I am the Advocacy and Education Director at Hunger Free Vermont, and it is my pleasure today to be talking with you all at ECDL and to be talking about universal school meals. We are a pretty manageable size group, so if you're here and you want to turn on your screen, I welcome you to do so we can see each other. I have a couple of slides prepared to just share a little bit of context for why we're advocating for universal school meals and what's happening so far this year in the legislature and how you all can get involved. But I really am hoping that this can be a conversation. So I invite questions throughout. You can drop them in the chat box. If you have a question while I'm talking, feel free to wave at me or raise your hand and I'll pause. I'll also make sure I pause throughout to see what kinds of questions there are, but I'm hoping to just share a little bit and then really open it up for a discussion. And we have about 45 to 50 minutes together today. So I'm happy to see you all here. And I was going to do introductions, but it looks like a lot of folks have their cameras off, so I'm not sure if they're actually here or not. So perhaps if you have a question or something to share, feel free to, or if you can just introduce yourself and kind of where you're coming from today, that would be great. And if you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat too, that is wonderful as well. And so like I said, my name is Faye Mack. I work at Hunger Free Vermont. I'm the Advocacy and Education Director, and I'm also on the steering committee of the Vermont Early Childhood Advocacy Alliance. And I use she, her pronouns. So we can go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen. And I will say that once I'm sharing my screen, it's a little bit hard for me to see the chat. So Natalie, if there are questions coming up in the chat, will you let me know?
I sure will.
Great. Okay. All right. And let me just, oops. Okay. So can folks see the very nice Universal School Meals pretty logo? All right, great. Thank you for the head nods. So we're here today to talk about universal school meals. And when we get into talking about actually what's happening in the legislature, I am excited to sort of share that we're talking about universal school meals and more this year, a little bit broader than that as well, but we'll focus in on universal school meals as the topic for this conversation. So some of this might be familiar for you all, but I wanted to just start by providing a little bit of context about what's happening in Vermont right now in terms of hunger and sort of why do we care about food insecurity among children. And so prior to the pandemic, food insecurity had been declining at a pretty steady rate ever since the spike during the Great Recession. And we had been holding pretty steady at about 1 in 10 Vermonters for several years. We do know that families with young children are more likely to struggle with hunger, so that number was higher for families with kids. But we were kind of stagnant at about 1 in 10 Vermonters. And what's interesting to note, and it's on this chart, is that we had kind of returned to where we were prior to the recession, and it took us 12 years to get there. So we know, as we look ahead to recovering from the pandemic, we know that families struggling to meet basic needs like accessing food and paying for housing, that struggle will continue long after the crisis of the pandemic and the health concerns end. The recovery from these kinds of disruptions and economic recessions takes a long time. And while we were sort of stagnant at 1 in 10, and it was where we were before the recession, that's still too many people, and not something that we want to strive for. But when the pandemic first started back in last March, we saw an immediate and dramatic spike in hunger. We know from a study that was led by the University of Vermont that over the course of the pandemic, about 30% of people in Vermont have faced hunger. That's higher, if you recall back to that graph before, that's higher than we saw during the Great Recession. It's higher than we've ever seen in at least the 20 to 25 years plus that we have data for. And we also know that households with children are 2 times more likely to be facing hunger during the pandemic. So families with kids are really struggling right now at rates that we've never seen before. And this picture that I have on the screen is an aerial shot from one of the farmers to family food box distributions managed by the food bank earlier this year in Barrie, where there were lines for hours of people waiting to get a box of food, which just goes to show kind of the level of crisis that people are facing. And throughout the pandemic, one of the primary areas of response and one of the bright lights in the pandemic response has been school and summer meal providers in the ways that they have stepped up to support children and their families. Thanks to some temporary waivers from the United States Department of Agriculture, meals have been free for all children 18 and under since last March, and they'll continue to be that way until the end of the school year, and actually until the end of the summer. That was just announced yesterday. So the waivers have been extended, and so we'll see summer meal programs operating like they did last year, making meals free for any kid in Vermont, 18 and under. The programs have faced a lot of challenges in that time. They've really stepped up. Vermont was the only state in the country who saw an actual increase in the number of meals served in that first month of school closures in April. We also served more meals in the summer of last year than we did the summer of the year before. So we've actually seen an increase thanks to the really kind of holistic and comprehensive approach that Vermont has taken to making sure that kids have access to the meals. Whereas throughout the country, we're seeing dramatic declines in participation because the meals are just not available in the same way that they are in Vermont. And so I share all of that just to give a little bit of context of where we are. So right now, all schools are providing universal school meals. Kids are able to access meals for free. Their families don't have to fill out a form or an application. And we're hearing about the impact that has on families. And so that's just helpful context to know as we talk about kind of what we want as we recover from the pandemic, how we can avoid going back to where 1 in 10 Vermonters are hungry, but actually move forward to a better future where we can learn from the pandemic and learn from fix systems that weren't working before, that were inequitable before.
Faye, there was just a question in the chat. I don't know if you saw it.
I did. So
Okay.
all children. So right now, all children 18 and under, so 0 to 18, can access meals through the school meal program. So some child care providers are partnering with their local school to get meals to kids. Families can also sign up with their school to go pick up a meal. So if their child is homeschooling this year, if they are not yet school age, during remote learning days, they can also still access meals. It requires a little bit of coordination and knowing and kind of understanding the system a little bit from families if they have children who aren't yet school age. But it is available and will be available in that same way through the summer as well. I think we likely saw more young children participate during the summer than during the school year because it's more part of the community rather than part of the school system, but they are available. And I will say that's not normal. That's part of sort of the temporary waivers that are available right now. Great, good question. So what were school meals looking like before the pandemic? Where are we or where were we? Before the pandemic, about 25% of public schools were providing universal school breakfast and or school lunch. And what that means is that All children had access to school meals without any charge to them or their families. So there's no school meal debt, and any child who wanted to eat while at school was able to do so. What we know for schools that don't have universal school meals is that in all schools without universal school meals, the shame, the stigma, and the expense keep students who need school meals from eating them, even students who are eligible for free meals. We know that there are about 42% of children in Vermont who are food insecure are not actually eligible for free school meals or for 3 Squares Vermont. Their families' incomes are too high. So there are a lot of kids out there who aren't even eligible to access the free or reduced price meals, and so aren't eating them because their families aren't able to also afford the paid meal. And children who are eligible who aren't participating because of the stigma that comes with eating a free school meal. Most school meal budgets, so school meal programs are funded through a combination of federal reimbursements, some state funding, and then other sources of revenue like catering for school budget, school board meetings, selling snacks, and selling meals to adults. Most school meal programs aren't able to cover the full cost of serving school meals through those sources of revenue. And so anything that's left over in the school meal budget is just incorporated into the school budget. And so it's borne through the education fund. And that's how school meals are paid for now. We know that unfortunately, so any school in Vermont is able to enroll in a federal provision to provide universal school meals. But we know that without state action, we'll never get to 100% of schools taking that option and providing that, because for most schools, universal school meals will always require an increased financial investment through the school budget from their communities. And that's because more kids are eating and because families would no longer be charged.
Hey, there was another question in the chat.
Sure.
Does this include kids who attend private school?
So any school can use the National School Breakfast and National School Lunch program, and they can enroll in those provisions. So that goes for independent schools, nonprofit schools, private schools. They can enroll in the program. Some do and some do not, and it's up to the individual school. When we start talking about the proposed legislation, I will say that the proposed legislation only applies to public schools. And that's, simply because it's very challenging for the state to mandate anything for independent schools in Vermont. But we do know that independent schools are really interested in providing universal school meals and hope and expect that they would come along with the public schools. So why universal school meals? I talked a little bit about the shame and the stigma, but why do we think that universal school meals is the answer and so important? Well, we want more than 25% of schools to be providing it. We want all schools to be providing it. There have been studies in Vermont and across the country that have shown that universal school meals improve student well-being and improve school culture. It also includes learning. So every school in New York City provides universal school meals and has done so since 2017. And they found that when schools moved to universal school meals, learning performance in math and English language arts improved by up to 10 weeks, which essentially erases summer learning loss, which we all know is a huge challenge for low-income families in particular. We also saw that the greatest improvements in learning were found among students who weren't previously eligible for free or reduced price meals. And so if you remember, that there's that 42% of food insecure kids who aren't eligible for free or reduced price meals in Vermont. So they would really see much of the biggest impact. And for some context, in Vermont, a family of 4 can be over income for free meals and still make $30,000 less than they need to cover their basic needs, using the basic needs budget from the Joint Fiscal Office. We've also seen, it's a little fuzzy, I apologize. These are just some other benefits of universal school meals that we found in a study done by the University of Vermont on Vermont schools that have moved to universal school meals. We hear that students are more ready to learn. We also hear that just the whole culture in the cafeteria changes. Students are no longer segregated by income, and it's a lot less, family differences in income are less visible. And one of the things that we really hear is that administrators, principals, and other administrators get to have a whole new kind of relationship with caregivers. They are often the debt collectors. So when families owe money to the school meal program, the principal is the one who's calling. And that creates a whole tension between caregivers and the administrators. And when that is removed and money is taken out of the relationship, the caregivers and administrators are able to build a really positive relationship that's focused on the students' well-being and the students' learning. And that's one of the greatest benefits from the administrator perspective in a lot of ways. So we have some legislation. So now we'll talk a little bit about the bill. And before I do, and Judy, I love your enthusiasm. Thank you. Are there any other questions about what I've shared before we kind of dive into what's happening this year? Okay, great. So there's legislation being looked at and discussed in both the House and the Senate that essentially would require all public schools in Vermont to enroll in those federal options that are available to provide universal school meals. Schools would have 5 years to make the switch, so it creates a phase-in period. And that means that they would be able, so some schools might be ready to go right now. And we're hearing from a lot of schools that don't want to go back to the old model when these waivers end. They want to continue with universal school meals. So they can they could enroll this year. But if a school needs a little bit more time to either get their community on board, to make improvements to their cafeteria, a lot of cafeterias need a bigger fridge once more kids start eating. They have up to 5 years to prepare and to make that switch. And as I mentioned before, any school can do this now. There's no restriction now. But what's great about the legislation is that it provides some additional support for schools in doing so that's not available right now. So the legislation includes some one-time grant funding to support schools so that schools can tap into some money for equipment that they might need, or bringing on some temporary staff to help with the administrative side of enrolling in the program, or to sort of offset some of the increased costs. The bill also includes an additional position at the Agency of Education so that the agency has the capacity to support schools and provide help as they're making that transition. The other important thing to know about the bill is that it requires schools to use those federal provisions, to enroll, to use the national programs, and to implement best practices in how the meal program is operated and meals are served, to help ensure that we're pulling down as much federal dollars as possible. So the goal is to limit the impact at the state level. The way that the program would be funded is the same way that school meal programs are funded now. So it actually doesn't change the funding structure. So any cost in the school meal program that's not funded, not covered by the other sources of revenue, like federal and state dollars and other revenue sources, would be incorporated into the school budget. And that's, the same as how we pay for textbooks and school nurses and all of the other things that students have access to throughout the school day.
Faye, there's a question in the chat.
Sure.
What's the bill number and status?
I will get to that in just
Okay.
1 minute, if you don't mind holding that question. So, the question we get from legislators and we get from communities is, how much is this? Sounds great, but how much is it going to cost? Our estimate is that so again, remember there's a 5-year ramp up period. So the impact, the investment grows over 5 years. And what we estimate is that after 5 years, the impact on the education fund will be about $21 million per year on the education fund. And that is not you can't really divide that out by 5 over the 5 years to see how it grows. And you can't really divide that out over the number of schools. The cost is going to be different for different communities because school meal programs run really differently. There are different numbers of students, and the amount that the federal government pays is dependent on the socioeconomic makeup of the school. So the impact, the $20 to $25 million impact, that's sort of the overall how we would see the education fund increase. The impact on individual communities is of within that 20 to 25 million is dependent on each community. We get a lot for that money. So, we've talked a little bit about culture in the classroom and the cafeteria. We bring equity to the school meal program, and then all the benefits that come with universal school meals. We also would see about $10 million more from federal reimbursements flow into the school meal program and support local purchasing as well. And really excitingly, we'd see 65% more school meals served each year. And that translates to, these numbers are actually last year's, and they both went down a little bit. I just found out this morning because our student population has gone down a bit. But about 23,000 more students would be eating school breakfast on any given day. And about 18,000 more students would be eating school lunch on any given day. So it's still about 100% increase in school breakfast and 45% increase in school lunch. So we feed so many more children. We also would eliminate school meal debt. So families would no longer owe money to schools. And if families can't pay that, it's absorbed by the school at the end of the year. So that would be a burden lifted off of both families and the schools. And right now we think that it's really hard to estimate, but we think that that costs Vermont about $1 million a year. So how's it going so far? So this gets to the question around bill number and status. Most of the activity so far has been in the Senate. So the Senate Agriculture Committee has actually written a committee bill. It's S100, and it's called the Farm Fresh School Meals for All bill. And it includes all of these provisions for universal school meals. And it also includes a local purchasing incentive program, which provides schools with some state funding to support their increase in buying local food from Vermont farmers and Vermont producers. And it funds the Farm to School and Early Childhood Grant Program, which supports farm to school efforts in schools and in early childhood providers. Right now, that program is underfunded at about $171,000 a year, and this would bring it up to $500,000 a year, which would really help deepen the expansion, especially in early childhood. The bill was passed out unanimously with tripartisan support at the end of February from the committee. And so right now it's in the Education Committee. So they're doing hearings on the bill this week. Our hope is that they pass it out by the end of the week, which would allow it to continue to move forward before crossover, which is a big deadline that's coming this week and next week. So we expect it to kind of move through the Education Committee this week, and then it would go to the Appropriations Committee, and then the whole Senate votes on it, and we start all over again in the House. A Universal School Meals bill has been introduced in the House. It's just the Universal School Meals bill, and that's H32. And there's been some conversation about it in the Education Committee there, but they're really looking forward to working on a Senate bill when it comes over. So they've had a little bit of preliminary conversation, but are more or less waiting for the Senate to send over their bill. So that's a little bit about where we are. And I'm noting Grace's question around meal quality. I think that's a great conversation to have. Let's hold that for when we can I can stop sharing my screen and we can open it up and have a bit of that conversation. So, but this actually gets to it a little bit. I do want to share sort of why we're so excited about S100 and having the components of all three components together. We know that school meal quality and participation are inherently linked. And what we see in Vermont is what we call a virtuous cycle. That when more students eat in the school meal program, so when Universal School Meals happens and we see an increase in participation, that helps bring in more money for the school meal program. When they have greater revenue, and if it's coupled with this local purchasing incentive, which helps increase their revenue even more, they have a higher ability to purchase Vermont produced food and to serve local food. And when coupled with Farm to School, it creates student understanding and connection with local food, where they're really excited to eat that fresh food and go down the salad bar and all of that. So that can improve the meal quality greatly and bring more fresh food into the schools, which then the meals taste better and they're more exciting. And they have the carrots from the farm that, you know, the third grade class went and visited last week on a farm trip or field trip with Farm to School. And so students are excited to eat the meals, and we see it increase participation again. So it all kind of works as this virtuous cycle where it builds upon each other. And the three components of S100 really help make that cycle spin. So there are a number of different ways that folks can get involved in the Universal School Meals campaign. And I will touch on a couple of ideas, but I'm really interested in talking with you all about your ideas and what you're thinking of. The best way to just get engaged and to stay up to date about the campaign is to go to universalschoolmealsvt.org, and you can sign up for our newsletter. I'm sending out a big update today. So you'll get at least a monthly update and calls to action, and in between. There are also ways on that website to show your support. So if you go to the website, you can see my little purple arrow at the top. If you click on the Act button, you'll get to a menu where you can sign a supporter card. It's a way to say why you care about Universal School Meals, and we'll share those with legislators at key moments, especially over the next month or so. If you represent an organization or a business, you can sign that group on to an organizational support letter. We have over 80 businesses and organizations across the state who've signed on so far. And again, we share that with legislators. And most importantly for today, though, mention Universal School Meals in S100 when you're in your lunch with legislators. Let them know it's something that you are interested in, ask them what they think about it, and we can talk a little bit about, you know, what you might say if you have questions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen because this is just sort of a bullet list, and we can talk a little bit more about it. Okay. Thank you, Natalie, for putting the website in there. I will say the website's a work in progress. It's really hard to build a website in the middle of the legislative session. But we are working on, you know, constantly adding more information on there so that folks can get what they need. But the Act button is a great place to go to learn about what to do and to get involved. So we have about 15-20 minutes, and I want to just open it up for conversation to see what people are thinking about. If there are questions, Grace, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about meal quality. I'm happy to do that, and also happy to talk about different ways to get involved and ideas that you all may have about how to support this effort as it moves forward.
I'm happy to initiate a conversation about
Great.
the health of school meals. We have one very small part of our program that participates in breakfast and lunch, and I think snack too.
And Grace, where are you from?
Sorry, Bennington.
Oh, great.
County Head Start, and I am the health manager. I'm not a teacher. My concern with that program is that we often see incredibly poor quality breakfast. We have these things that we don't do breakfast with them anymore. We have something they call cruller sticks that are about this big in a package, and the package is clear and you can see the grease on the inside of the package. And if you look at the number of grams of sugar, it's not something we could ever condone giving to children. I used to call them cocaine sticks because that's what it felt like when I tasted one. The sugar just slams into your taste buds. Really poor quality. And I found the other day that our lunches, which they used to cook in the kitchen next door, are now being delivered. They're all prepackaged. I looked at one of the lunches they serve on a Monday. It had 45 grams of added sugar 750 calories. This is preschooler, 750 calories, 745 added sugar grams. This is not something that I feel good serving to children. Even if we split the serving size in half, because they are, they're grade school serving sizes, that's still 22 added sugar grams, which I just can't condone it. We're also fighting an obesity epidemic. Although universal school meals contribute to equity, I don't want the equity to include everybody gets to be equally obese. If we could address the quality, I would really appreciate it, because I just can't anymore look at those meals and say, yay. I want
Sure. So I appreciate you sharing that, and I can address a couple of things that you said. The first is that meal quality differs throughout the state. Every school meal program is different. Many are, and are trying to meet their budget. School meal programs are the only part of the education system where they're asked to fund themselves, including all of the benefits, healthcare, staffing, custodial services, or bus services. They don't have to pay for their own staff within their budget. School meal budgets are held separately in most schools. And so school meal quality differs, and there's a lot of work being done to increase scratch cooking, to help schools improve their cafeterias. There was a big move over the last 30-40 years, where school meal programs really moved to prepackaged food, and the effort is, the trend is moving in the other direction now, thanks to things like farm to school. All school meal programs, breakfast and lunch, well, a component might have a lot of sugar and all of that, and I'm not saying that those are good, but they do have to meet dietary requirements in terms of sugar, salt, whole grains, all sorts of nutrients, and those were increased under the Obama administration. The program is designed for school-age children. So right now in COVID, the meals are available for children who are younger than school age. The dietary requirements aren't, they're meeting the dietary requirements for the school-age children. And the meals are different this year. So that is one thing I will say. We're talking a lot about how schools have universal school meals right now. It isn't the universal school meal program that we envision and that we talk about. School meals are being prepackaged. There are many more kind of cold lunches being served, because they're being served for, they're being available for pickup or delivery for children who are learning at home, and they're all eating in the classroom. So kids aren't going to the cafeteria. There's no ability to have a salad bar or a hot bar right now. Everything is sort of being trucked around because of the health precautions for COVID. So when we talk about universal school meals in the long term, we're also talking about a return to the cafeteria and to hot food and salad bars and all of those things. But I will acknowledge that there's a lot of work to do around meal quality in some schools. And in some schools, the meals are, incredibly local, and I've eaten fiddleheads at schools, all sorts of really fresh food, and universal school meals can help with that. So again, it brings in more money. I don't know if you noticed in the slide about the study with New York City, but we also saw obesity decrease in schools when they moved to universal school meals. So school meals have been shown to be healthier on the whole than packed lunches, and that we see health improvements in terms of weight and obesity. So individual schools have individual experiences, and I encourage you all to learn about your local school meal program and to advocate for high quality meals and good nutrition. But overall, what we do see is a really strong impact in the health and nutrition of students. So I don't know, Grace, if that helps at all. I'm not discounting your experience.
I know that the data is correct, and I would say that the school meals that were served are probably healthier than what we've seen students bring in the past in other parts of our program. I agree with that. I would really appreciate it if we're going to have universal school meals, that it be linked with quality and better oversight over that quality. Because I know when we serve CACFP meals, we have somebody come in and they actually look at the quality of what we're serving the children. And they tell us what they think. That, if we're serving a fruit and a vegetable, they'll say, why aren't you serving 2 vegetables? Well, that's a really high quality. Why are the school nutrition programs not overseen to that quality?
Great. Riva, I see your question in the chat. I wonder if you want to just ask it. And
I'm just interested to hear, I'd like to see universal meals in childcare, and I'm curious if any schools are partnering. I'm working with some folks up in Alburg who are in a partnership with the school, and our hope is that the school meals can be extended to the childcare center that's going to be right next door. I'm just curious if you know anything about, do the rules allow that, or other schools doing it anywhere? Because it seems like a way that childcare programs who may not have kitchens or that access to that kind of thing can be part of getting universal meals to the kids.
yeah, so schools that are operating pre-K programs, either in the building or connected to the school, in however they're connected officially, can serve universal school meals to those students. In normal times, without the pandemic, the National School Breakfast and School Lunch Program aren't available to early childhood providers in general. CACFP, which Grace mentioned, the Child and Adult Care Food Program, is the federal nutrition program for childcare, and it's a really different program than the school lunch programs, particularly because we don't have universal childcare. If we, the CACFP program doesn't work for all childcare providers in Vermont. It's a program that's really designed for large centers. In urban areas, it works great in other parts of the country, but isn't available for all providers. We would really love, universal, making sure that all kids have access to meals wherever they are in their day is our goal. And so universal access to meals in early childhood education settings is also part of our work. It's separate from this Universal School Meals campaign. I can share one of the things we're doing right now. So the Child Care is Essential bill, H171, that's being considered. That bill includes some work over the next year or two to identify the full cost of childcare, and we're working to be able to incorporate meals into that. So the cost of meals was somewhat incorporated by the Blue Ribbon Commission study a few years ago. But there are a lot of programs who are providing meals outside of the federal nutrition program. They're just, providers are just paying for it and providing something out of pocket. And we don't actually know who's doing what. So one of the things that Hunger Free Vermont is working on this year is trying to figure out exactly what is happening in early childhood education settings in terms of both using the federal nutrition program and not, but sort of who's serving meals, how much is it costing them, what are the barriers to doing so that we can work as we're sort of trying to make a more equitable and accessible early childhood education system, that food is part of that and part of the way that we're caring for our kids.
So I know that CACFP has a price that they pay for food for kids, but is there any data, either nationally or statewide, on, and maybe this is what you're trying to get and we don't have it, on the actual cost of what it takes to
that's part of what we're trying to get at, because it's different, and what providers receive as a reimbursement is different if they're a for-profit, if they're nonprofit, if they're a home provider, if they're a center, and all of that. It's a very complicated program, and some folks have to qualify for it in a reimbursement way every month, as opposed to, some providers have to submit eligibility for using the program once a month instead of once a year. There's a lot around the program that makes the burden is really high on providers.
If I could jump in, Faye, hi everybody. I've been operating childcare centers for like 32, 33 years in Vermont, and I am so content now not to be a part of CACFP or CCFP, whatever it is.
CACFP.
CACFP. I'm really happy not to be bound by some things that I have deep philosophical differences with. We pay out of pocket. I was just checking it out this morning, somewhere between $4,000 and $5,000 a month for food. We belong to a farm, a CSA, so we get a lot of meat and produce from a local farmer, or he's in Craftsbury, but and we shop at 2 stores locally and Costco on the edge. Okay. I absolutely love the fact that I have had the same cook for 26 years. We have wonderful food program, and she's very attentive to who needs what kind of portion size. And, that plate is always filled with a fruit and a vegetable or 2 and a protein and what do you call them? The gluten-free part. A lot of kids seem to be gluten-free. But my reality is it's the good, solid menu for kids. We just don't, we might have 1 kid a month show up with a Pop-Tart in his hand. Mostly we have children who are eager to run in and have the, scrambled eggs and ham and whatever. Those kids are happy to come to the child care center to have the food that's available there. You have to make your food attractive to kids, and the adults will eat anything. I found we have to have a whole other third of cooking for the adults. That might be the size of my budget, right? But the reality is you've got to make it kid friendly. You've got to make it tasty and good. And you've got to help children learn how to try, learn how to just give it a little shot here, just a little shot. And in a while, you'll find that kids will eat and eat happily and come back for more.
Judy, how many kids are you serving for that monthly amount?
For that monthly amount, we have 66 children.
And that's the staff too?
No, the staff is at 77 people.
But you're feeding both of them for the $5,000 a month.
We're feeding both of them for the $5,000 a month.
That's
Marty,
super helpful.
It's super helpful, yeah. And the fact is, I have great relationship with my friend Marty, friends for 43 years. He has a store right down on the way to St. Johnsbury in Danville, Marty's first stop. I get everything caseload with no added percentage of, it costs 10% more because you're getting caseload staff. Because, and we don't serve juices all the time anymore. We with snack, we're serving a lot of water. We're serving a lot of, juice maybe once a week, but maybe once every 2 weeks. We're careful about what we're putting into our kids. We have actually 1 child now that I'm worried about in terms of obesity. That's 1 child out of 66. Although some of those babies are really fat.
Do you get formula too, Judy? Do you buy formula for the babies?
I buy some formula for the babies, but most of my parents are WIC eligible, so they supply their own. But I do buy formula for a couple of babies. And I'm just really so thrilled that we can do the work that needs to be done. The impact I want to have that I'm trying to increase is on what's happening at home. Are they eating, Chef Boyardee ravioli and stuff like that? Or do you know what I mean? That's the impact we're trying to have. So we're trying to help our parents understand the importance of good nutrition in the home front. And that's hard because they don't have enough money to get there. Their food stamps. So one of the parents said to me the other day, they used to last about 3 weeks out of the month. And now barely 2 weeks and a couple of days in terms of their food stamps and what that's helping them with. So.
Do farm to school early childhood grants help at all? How do those work?
Well, I think it will. I'm applying for one on the 19th of February. I'm applying for one. Again, I have a wonderful relationship with Mystic Morning Farm in Craftsbury. And he delivers way more than I pay for in terms of CSA. And, you know, kids are happy now with spaghetti squash. What can I tell you? They'll eat whatever is presented, especially if it seems like a little fun. If you tell them it's spaghetti squash, that went over more easily than a few other things. But the challenge is always getting good quality, fresh food and, you know, fresh organic meats. So we, you know, beef stew at Cherry Street Play Care is just the best.
Judy, thanks for sharing
Sure.
what's happening. I always appreciate that. We have just a couple more minutes, and there's a few questions that are coming up about the universal school meals legislation. So if I would like to turn us back to that, if that's okay. Oh no, sorry, I was muted.
Sorry, I hit that by accident. I meant to mute myself.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Great. Someone had a hand up, and I seem to have. Was it Linda? Did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I did. Kind of getting back to the legislation part. First of all, you said that you were going to hit on a little bit about what we can do during the luncheon session as far as speaking to the legislators. The other thing is can you speak to whether like the NEA has supported universal school meals, or what other backing is there?
So I'll go backwards. So the NEA has been part of the NEA and the School Nutrition Association of Vermont, Vermont Feed, and a number of superintendents, business administrators, and school food service directors have all been part of a core group that helped develop the structure of the bill. So they are 100% behind the legislation. We also have groups from Outright Vermont. We have businesses like National Life who've signed on in support. We also know that there will be some conversation over the next few weeks about exactly how the education fund pays for universal school meals. And there's some interest in exploring different ways for that paying to happen. So that conversation is to come, but within that conversation around cost, we know that the Vermont Principals Association, the Superintendents Association, and the School Board Association are all really supportive of the idea of universal school meals and really want to help figure out how to move it forward in a way that works for schools. So that's a little bit about some of the folks who've been signed on and helpful in supporting this. In terms of talking with legislators today, so I would, you know, if you're speaking with a senator, if you have a senator at your table, I would encourage you to mention S100. If it's something that you support, to bring it up as something that you support, to ask their opinion on it, and let them know that you're excited about it and excited about addressing food insecurity in this way. For the House, you know, if it's a representative, you can mention H32, which is the Universal School Meals Bill, and also mention the bill that's likely coming from the Senate. You know, again, that one is really exciting because it helps to address local food and food quality as well. And so I know we have just a couple of seconds left, and I see a question from Michael about administrative and oversight supports. So Michael, I mentioned before that the Agency of Education would gain a position. So there would be a person within the Agency of Education whose purpose is to support schools in enrolling in the federal program and navigating that transition. And then the Agency of Education has a lot of oversight over school meal programs. So they audit the meal programs. They're looking, you know, they're coming in, they're doing the kinds of things that Grace was talking about happens in childcare providers around looking at menus and coming in and checking out the food and the production. Hunger Free Vermont and other organizations also provide a lot of support for schools in doing, you know, helping with technical assistance around meal planning and how the meals are served, school meal application campaigns, how the program is being framed for families to decrease stigma. So there's a lot that comes with a school as a school transitions onto universal school meals. Yeah, you're welcome. I think we're at time. I really appreciate everyone's thoughtful conversation and your questions. I'm going to just really quickly put my email address in the chat. I encourage you to reach out anytime if you're interested in learning more or getting engaged. And I hope that you'll sign up for our newsletter so you can stay informed as the legislation moves forward. And enjoy the rest of your day.